Damas and Erin, mesdames et messieurs, damas y caballeros. The reason I believe we don't include the true history of Manhattan in our traditional scope of American history has more to do with language than it does to do with the fact that it happened a century and a half before the United States ever existed. And in order to illustrate this theory, I simply point to the Pilgrims. Now, when I said Pilgrims, you knew what I meant, right? I mean, if you went to school in the States or you go to school in the States, of course you do. I mean, the ones who sailed over here on the Mayflower in 1620, landed on Plymouth Rock, made friends with all the Native Americans who brought them a bunch of corn. So they smoked the peace pipe and then all sat down joyously and invented Thanksgiving and lived happily ever after. Well, it didn't really go exactly like that. But the more pertinent part of this misconception, the part that I'm so oddly obsessed with, is the fact that we all know and talk about the Plymouth Pilgrims, as we should to some extent. Yet when I tell people that there were actually Manhattan Pilgrims, they go, what? And not only were there Manhattan Pilgrims, but they came from the same place as the Plymouth Pilgrims and shared the same religion, but not the same language, because they were all refugees of the Great Reformation. So, while many will consider George Washington the father of our country, and I would not disagree, then I would suggest that perhaps Martin Luther is, say, the great-grandfather of our country. Because if he had never published his 95 Theses, the Pilgrims probably wouldn't have come here about 100 years later. Yeah, this story is complicated. And to help me untangle it just a bit are two friends from across the water who know more than a bit about exactly what I'm talking about. So from l'Université de Nantes, Madame Virginie Adane, and from the Université de Paris, Professor Bertrand van Ruymbeke. Madame, Monsieur, welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for being here. Virginie, firstly, I'm so glad to have you here for the first time because, after all, what does this guy know? You know, I'm kidding, Bertrand. I like to use your sense of humor. You and I had a great conversation, which was now over 2 years ago at this point, back in 2020. But before we get into the story and the major questions, can you let everybody know, because I didn't know until I really started doing this research, what is a Walloon?
There is an easy answer and a more complex answer. An easy answer would be to say that a Walloon is French-speaking Calvinist. In fact, you mentioned, and I like the idea, you mentioned that Martin Luther could be the grandfather of the US, but there is also John Calvin. And since the Puritans, the Huguenots, the Dutch Reformed, and the Walloons were all Calvinists. And to be honest, the difference between these four groups, except maybe the Puritans once they were in New England, because they created what is called the New England Way, and that became known as Congregationalism, so diverted a bit from European Calvinism. But in Europe, the Independents, that is the name of the Puritans in England, the Dutch Reformed, the Walloons, and the Huguenots followed the same theology and ecclesiology. They were basically Calvinists, just like the Scotch Presbyterians. So you are right to highlight the Reformation in Europe. So the difference between the Walloons and the Huguenots, let's start with this, is basically geographic, not so much religious. Because you have to think of the Walloons were, let's say, the Walloons were from what is now today northern France and Belgium, and a series of provinces that were during that period, let's say from the 1580s to the 1620s, they were at war. This was a war zone. That's why we talk about refugees. you know, not just religious refugees, but war refugees. And basically, Huguenots were subjects of the French king, so they were born in the French kingdom, whereas the Walloons were in this what was called the Spanish Netherlands at the time.
Okay, so the simple, thank you, very good explanation. So the simple split, the simple distinction between Walloon and Huguenot is one of them hails essentially from what was Belgium, what is Belgium now, and one hails essentially from what is France.
Yes, to the exception that you can have Walloons from northern France.
Yeah, I was about to say that because my husband's family comes from Valenciennes, which is part of the Walloon territory from that time, and Valenciennes is currently in northern France. But this is the same area, basically, the north of France, or French-speaking Belgium.
So you are related to Joris Rapalje.
Yeah, when I told him that, he couldn't believe it. I said, "Hey, you guys, you founded New York." He wouldn't
Quite
believe it,
prestigious.
right?
Yeah, well, Joris comes into our story early on in season 2 because he came over in, oh goodness, 1624 or
Yeah,
24, I think.
23, 24. Well, his wife told the story.
Mm-hmm.
His wife, Catalina Trico,
Right.
the story. And in her testimony, she says 1623, but probably the boat arrived in 24.
She forgot is the story that I got, that she wasn't, it was 60 years later and she was trying to
Yeah.
recall the details.
She was 80 plus years when she testified. So she was a very elderly and honorable lady, but she was very old. Yeah.
And that's something that leads into my next major question, which is like these kids, they were kids. They were 18, they were 19 and 18 years old, Joris and Catalina, when they came over. And they, by the way, had, if they didn't have the first child in New Netherland, the first child of European descent born in New Netherland, well, then they had the second, because it was either her or Sarah Dutry, who was the first to be born here. And that gal, that young lady, Sarah Rapalje, their daughter, would be the 7th great grandmother of Humphrey Bogart. That's
Absolutely.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
But my question is, why the Walloons? Why were they available? Why were they chosen by the Dutch to go be the boots on the ground, so to speak? And why were they willing? And how were they able to survive when many other people didn't and wouldn't even try to?
Well, why the Walloons? One of the first answers, I think you gave it. When you mentioned that they were the other pilgrims, that they were willing to move across the ocean at the time. There was this community in Leiden that had formed, including both Walloons and Huguenots. So this time they was mixed together, and they had petitioned the English and the Dutch to move across the ocean. I can remember that Jesse de Forest had formed a petition, the round robin, to the English, to ask them to be allowed to move to Virginia. I guess it was in 1621, if I'm correct. And the English told him that it was okay, but they could not form a community in Virginia. So they declined the offer. And then they petitioned the Dutch to go across the ocean. So basically, they looked for a place to stay across the ocean, and also they went also on the in the Caribbean and Northern America. So that's the first part of the answer, I guess. They wanted to settle somewhere they would not be persecuted.
Right.
Yeah.
And now I think it's also really interesting to know that when I said the Pilgrims, the Plymouth Pilgrims and the Manhattan Pilgrims, so to speak, they came from the same place. That place was Leiden in the Netherlands. And they were all part of a bigger community of Reformed Protestants living and worshiping in Leiden, because the Puritans had left England because they were persecuted there, not allowed to practice that religion. And the Walloons, for instance, left the Spanish Netherlands for the same reason. And the Dutch folks came from various areas of the Netherlands to gather in Leiden. But before the Walloons made the deal with the Dutch West India Company, in fact, the Dutch West India Company was still forming, basically, even though they technically formed in 1621, they didn't really do anything until 1623. So they didn't quite have their act together. They went, and I think you mentioned this, they went to the Virginia Company of England, who had just sent the Pilgrims, the Plymouth Pilgrims, to, okay, so now here's the thing. Plymouth Pilgrims, where were they originally supposed to land?
Virginia.
Actually, I think they were supposed to go to the Hudson River.
Oh, yeah.
Well, one has to remember that America was Virginia, really, at the time. And it's true that the land that was granted to the Virginia Company of London and the land granted to the Virginia Company of Plymouth, the separation was about around the Hudson River. So probably they didn't want to settle in the Virginia Company of London territory, but as south as they could. But to go back to an earlier question, I just wanted to add something, is that, when you said why the Walloons, you have to think that these people were uprooted, and you have to think in terms of empires, and empires needed settlers, many settlers, because colonies, especially in the West Indies and the northern part of South America, were really people were, places where you died, basically. And so the idea is that you needed settlers, you needed sailors. Plus, you have to keep in mind that the United Provinces, that is the name that the Netherlands had at the time, the United Provinces were at war. So they were colonizing and at war at the same time. So they needed settlers and sailors. And you find the same phenomenon a century later, well, not quite a century later, but 70 years later with South Africa, where the BOC recruited Huguenots to settle in South Africa. So it's this need of settlers, and you have these refugees, uprooted people that are perceived as talented, well-trained, and available, basically available. So I wonder if it's the Walloons looking for a place, or if it's the Dutch companies looking for settlers, or both, actually.
A little bit of both, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, we talk about timing in the episode specifically that introduces the Walloons and their pertinence to this story of the history of Manhattan. We talk about it being timing. We say it's both.
Yes, because it's the same with the Huguenots, in the 1680s, when what were called the Restoration colonies, the Carolinas, New York, actually, New Jersey, were looking for settlers. Well, at the same time, the Huguenots were available because they were not expelled from France, as is currently believed and said, but as it was the opposite. They had to stay in France and convert, but at least those who managed to leave France were available. So true, timing is essential.
I couldn't have said it any better myself. Bertrand and Virginie, merci for this fascinating conversation about our very own Manhattan Pilgrims, or the Walloons, which we will pick up right here where we left off next week. Join us then, folks. Verdammt. Island Voices is a production of Chance Kelly, Inc. and may not be reproduced or re-exhibited in any manner, in whole or in part, without authorization. Thank you.